All right, I'll call this meeting to order at this time. I want to thank everyone for being here this afternoon and look forward to a healthy discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to call on our co-chair of our committee, Representative Peak, if he would open us in a word of prayer.
Lord, we thank you. We thank you for today. Thank you for all the blessings that you have bestowed upon us individually as you have done that so much, and we know that every good thing comes from you. Thank you for the blessings you've given our state, and we acknowledge that all those good things come from you as well, too. Give us wisdom today as we make decisions that affect the lives of our citizens of our state, that we might be smart and prudent and might do what's wise in your eyes as well, too. Thank you. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Representative Peak. We're here today to begin discussions on substitute, first of all, the Property Tax Reform Constitutional Amendment, H.R. 1246, and then I think after that we'll get into to the bill, and that is the Property Tax Reform bill itself. But before we call on the Speaker to present his bill, I just want to sort of set some of the ground rules here. I would anticipate that the majority of our time today will probably be spent in the presentation of the bill, questions from the committee members, and then we'll see where our time is at. But we're going to allow everyone ample time to have input. We're not going to cut anybody short. It may be another day, but we're going to see how far we can get into this today. And I would remind the members of the committee that we don't vote on concepts and ideas. We vote on the words on the pages on the bill. And I would encourage all the members in the audience, in light of what I just said, it would waste all of our time to take a lot of questions from people who have never even read the bill yet. So today we'll focus on reading the bill, the presentation of the bill. If you have a question, we'd like for you to write those questions down, and you can begin submitting those in writing to Lindsay Napier right here on the front next to the Speaker, and we will try to address those questions. But we think that it will make you think your questions through, and it'll lead to a quicker, more concise process. So at this time, I'd like to call on the Speaker of the House, Representative Glenn Richardson, if he would, to come and present House Resolution 1246.
Well, good afternoon.
Mr. Speaker, you may have to, are you on there?
I don't know. I'm not used to doing this. This will be a first. Here, let me help all these microphones.
Well, it's a first.
Maybe it'll help them get this one right.
It's a first for me too, Mr.
I
Speaker.
sometimes miss those.
I'm controlling your mic.
I'm glad we're friends. Let me start off. A former speaker used to say when he would come to bring a bill in committee, this little old bill doesn't do anything much except help the old folks and the children. And so I'm going to steal a little bit and say this little old bill doesn't do much except help the property owners of the state of Georgia. For the last year, I have undertaken to try and do something that has proved to be more difficult than I first imagined, but it is a reform of the system that we have of taxation in this state. The current system, I think it is now clear to everybody on this committee and to all Georgians, is antiquated, outdated, unfair, and inequitable. The system of ad valorem taxation has as the basis that citizens are told what they must pay and have no ability to affect that other than to lose their property or pay the tax. It's time to change that and start changing the concept. Now, before I get too far into this, I want to acknowledge that I know this committee and a lot of members of the Ways and Means have done a lot of work and taken a lot of shots and criticisms and suggestions over this, and we have opened up a debate for the first time in this state on serious reform of the tax system. And if nothing else comes out of this, we've proven that it's okay to talk about what we've always done. And it's okay to try and change. Now then, there's been some people that have worked really hard on this, and I can't take much of the credit except for barking orders at them, telling them to change this and change that. And one of them's legislative counsel, and Joe Shawyer, who I'll bet has drafted and redrafted this bill more times in this resolution than he wants to tell. Where is Joe? Yeah, he's hiding, so hopefully we have no more changes. And I'm joking, but I know he's tired of the changes. But he knows this subject so well. He knows how to draft these, and he has done a great job working on this. Lindsay Napier, who works for our committee, for your committee and for the House, has become a great expert. What she didn't know, she has learned about property taxes, has done a great job. And John Walraven, I think, is going to be here sooner or later in my council to help me in case I get into too much trouble. If you'll permit me, what I would like to do is give you what I'll say a global idea of what it is we're doing. Then I'll go into the details because I think it's important. Too many people want to try to remember what we were trying to do. And let me just say at the outset, I started off and intended and wanted to repeal all ad valorem taxes in Georgia. That has proven to be more change than most people could stand. And even though I think that's what we ought to strive for, that is not what we're doing anymore. And to that end, at the suggestion of one of your members, we have got a new resolution number. And we no longer tag this with a name other than property tax reform. It might also be called a property tax cut, because what I'm going to present to you today will wind up being a $422 million tax cut over the next 3 years for property taxpayers in Georgia. This idea started when we were looking at comprehensively changing the income tax, sales tax system. As you know, we have 120 or so exemptions to the sales tax code. Maybe it's 130 now. And interestingly, the same school that I went to, the Georgia State University Department of Economics, came out with a very sensational story a couple of years ago and said that if we would just eliminate all the exemptions to the sales tax code, we'd generate another $10 billion a year. Well, many times we see those reports, and especially if they're in one of the print editions of the fish wrappers in town, and we believe them. And I initially said, my goodness, $10 billion? We could eliminate exemptions and have $10 billion. And I did the math. We could virtually eliminate all property taxes and most income taxes for that. But when we started looking into it and peeling back the layers, it became clear that that was a little bit of a form over substance, and that wasn't exactly correct. And there weren't quite $10 billion worth of exemptions, especially when you looked at what the exemptions really were. So our initial reaction that we would just eliminate the exemptions and get a bunch of money and we would be able to replace property taxes and income taxes was misplaced. Frankly, it was misplaced because of the hype and wrong information put out by some economists that wanted to grab a story for a day, and they did. A little bit later on, I'll mention to you those the same economists who trumped that number up so dramatically 2 years ago. Now then, when we're looking at tax reform, used a number exactly 1/2 of the number they used when they wanted a sensational story. And I think it's important for me and you and all of us to understand when we ask for these fiscal notes. I used to have this idea that we were getting really good, unbiased information from these economists without any hint of a political agenda. I've discovered that is not correct information. The only way that we have to check the economic data is our state auditor, Mr. Hinton, who receives that information and can change that and look at it and decide what the hit needs to be. But simply to get an economics professor at one of our universities to come up with an opinion, well, it's jaded by their own biases and political preferences, and that's unfortunately what we had to deal with in this process. But for the purposes of this process, I'm going to accept the economic data that's been put out there, the numbers that have put out there, and I'm going to take us forward through this process using those numbers. And when I tell you this is a $422 million tax cut, it's based upon the best information that's been out there. The state auditor has now used those numbers for the next 3 years. If we implement the changes that I've outlined to you, it will result in $422 million less dollars being paid by the taxpayers of the state of Georgia. Now, before you jump to conclusions and think, my goodness, how will we do that? In 1996, when we took the sales taxes off groceries, the fiscal note that had been written in 1995 indicated that when fully implemented by the year 2000, the cost to take the taxes off of groceries would be $520+ million a year. So, for us to take up a $420 million cut some 10 years later sort of shows you just how big that was when that decision was made. Or it perhaps shows you this is not nearly as big as $420 million suggests. Now, what is it that we're proposing to do? I think there's some broad general things, and when we finish our remarks here, we have what I'll call a cheat sheet. It's a one-page piece of paper that says property tax reform, and I will hand it out to you and make it available to the public so that if you want to look and say, what is it we're generally doing, you'll know. And I'll also put out a property tax reform of what was proposed to go through the Senate. Maybe not what came through the Senate, but what the Senate resolution should look like when we get through fixing it. The first thing that we intend to do is provide tax relief on personal motor vehicles. The way we propose to do this is to provide a credit to each taxpayer in the state of Georgia equal to the amount of taxes that would be due on their automobile. The reason we're doing that is because the mechanism we're setting up is a statewide system of collecting these monies. And so that the counties and cities and communities and schools don't come to us saying, don't cut money from us, we're not. They're going to get exactly the same amount that they put on the bill for taxes. So that if a tax bill is generated from a county or that has $100 owed on the car in taxes, it'll be like the homeowner tax relief grant. It will be zeroed out. We will provide a credit and we'll write a check from the state to the county for the exact amount of those taxes for that car. And the car owner will only pay whatever the registration fees are and a $20 fee that I'm going to discuss in a minute that's part of the revenue. Nothing else. The next thing that we are providing is a relief on homesteads. The intention is to do the exact same procedure that I just discussed with you for cars for school taxes on every homestead in Georgia. Every school district in Georgia will take the values in the digest. They will set their millage rate, and the bills will be prepared. And whatever the bill is for the school tax portion, that's how much the state will provide as a credit. No school district will lose anything. In fact, they'll get exactly what they would get as if the taxpayer wrote the check, the same as they do today under the homeowner tax relief grant. The difference is we're going to end the homeowner tax relief grant in favor of the homeowner's school tax relief grant. That's the only difference. So that if a tax bill is generated that's, let's say, on a home for $2,000, of which that would be, let's say, $1,000 in school taxes, although we know that's not possible, it would be that low. But if it were $1,000, the bill would be generated. If there is a homestead claimed, there would then say a credit of exactly the amount of the school taxes on the homestead. the state would send a check to the county for that exact amount of money as if the taxpayer had paid it. So that no school district will get 1 penny less than exactly what they charge for the tax bill as if the homeowner paid it. The next thing that we're going to do is, as I said, we'll substitute that for the homeowner tax relief grant program, and it will be in lieu of. There are some districts in Georgia where someone over a certain age pays no school taxes. We have, in conjunction with this plan, designed the homeowner tax relief grant plan to increase so that the taxpayer will either get the school tax relief or the homeowner tax relief grant relief, whichever is greater. If they're paying zero school tax, they'll recognize the savings in the homeowner tax relief grant. So when I said a while ago we won't be doing the homeowner tax relief grant, we will in certain counties that have exemptions from school taxes. Now then, quickly to point this out to you, some of you may be thinking, well, what if every school district in Georgia jumps on board and with local legislation? We're not going to allow that. We're freezing that as of right now. They won't be eligible to do that. If it wasn't effective as of 1/1/08, they will not be able to do that. Now then, to fund those two plans, the school tax relief and the personal vehicle relief, we will change the sales tax structure and the consumption structure as follows. We will tax lottery tickets at the state rate, 4%. We will tax groceries at the state rate. They're currently taxed at the local rate, whatever the state rate is. Groceries will now become subject to taxation. And we will institute a statewide sales tax on consumer services at the state rate. Because of the concern of taxing services, assuming this is approved on the ballot in November of 2008, it will have a delayed effective date of January 1st, 2010. And that's when the relief will come to the homeowners. That will give the Revenue Department a full 13 months and us another legislative session after this one to clarify what it is we mean by personal services. For the record, personal services are those that are between a person and a business, not business to business. We do not propose to tax business to business services. We do not propose in those personal services to tax medical services. We do not propose to tax child care services. And we do not propose to tax education services. And on top of that, we're going to cap the personal services tax at $10,000 per taxpayer, per vendor, per year, and that's on the amount of the expenditure, so that if you hired a personal services and paid $10,000, you would owe $400 worth of personal services tax. If you paid them more than $10,000 in 1 year, you would not owe more than the $400. The bill authorizes future tax relief. If more money comes in from this plan than we have anticipated, even though this shows a tax cut, if more money comes in as a result of this, we are authorized to use it for tax relief from school taxes to for all other properties. The tax cut that I mentioned to you starts out like this. The fiscal note projects that when we first start this, the first year there will be an extra $116.5 million generated. The second year will be an additional $288.3 million. And the third year it will be a cut in the 11 fiscal year of $826.9 million. One thing I did not clarify, but part of this is at the time of you registering your vehicle, you will pay a $20 fee. The way this legislation reads is you will pay a $20 fee, $10 of which shall be designated for trauma care. We are not putting that in a constitutional amendment to tag it as fees. We're simply indicating that that's where it should go and be budgeted. It would be up to the General Assembly to budget that money But we thought that was a good place to handle that. In light of the fact that we will be taking all taxes away from all personal vehicles, defined as if it's titled in the name of an individual, in that event, it would be a good time to place the $10 trauma fee on there with other $10. Now then, with your permission, I'll go forward with H.R. 1246. Section 1, I'm proceeding on LC version 187087. 7087. In section 1.2, this simply provides that if there's sufficient revenues available in the future as a result of property tax reform on or after January 1st, 2010, we're authorized to use such revenues to provide further property tax relief on property taxes for educational purposes in addition to the relief provided for below. I think it's been well documented that there were a lot of driving forces that caused me to look at property tax reform. One of them is the adequacy of school funding issue that comes up in this state. And the purpose of this section is to hope that when we start implementing this, we'll generate more money and be able to have a statewide school tax relief. What we're proposing today is simply replacing the school tax revenue with a statewide sales tax on homesteads. So the homesteads will get the relief from the school taxes, but non-homesteaded properties and businesses will not. This allows for future relief for property taxes for educational purposes. Section 1.3 provides for the property tax relief on homesteads through the HTRG system and the amount of the property taxes for education. Now then, let me see if I can explain this in this fashion. As I suggested earlier, there are counties, Cobb County comes to mind as a good one, where if you're, I believe it's Representative Parsons, if you're over 62, you pay no school taxes. 62 and older pays no school taxes. One of our concerns is that there are people that are in those counties that aren't paying school taxes, and if we implement this and put the sales taxes on groceries, lottery, and services, they would effectively be experience a tax increase. So what we did with the help of legislative councils, we crafted language that allows for the homeowner tax relief grant to be given a benefit up to $30,000. Right now, it's only authorized at $18,000, and we only fund at $8,000. The exact number will have to be subject to funding, but we will, by authorizing up to $30,000, what we can do is, with our funding mechanism, is we can give relief to those people that wouldn't get relief from this general proposal under this House resolution, so that people in Cobb County who are now paying a bill that has no school taxes would get to claim the homeowner tax relief grant to continue, so that they would get property tax relief. It just won't be on their school tax bill because they have a zero school tax bill. I think there are 7 jurisdictions in Georgia that pay no school taxes. So the effort here is to try to be fair to all counties in Georgia. Mr. Chairman, is it your preference that I keep going through this and then at the end ask questions?
Okay. I think that'd be fine.
Thank you. Section 1-4 takes care of those counties that currently use lost revenues to roll back their property taxes. There are more than one, maybe 2 counties. I know that Representative O'Neill has a county that uses lost revenues to roll back school taxes. Under this proposal, they would be adversely affected and not get a benefit of this. And so what we're proposing is to allow them to either repeal the lost or to redirect those revenues towards other property tax relief by a local constitutional amendment. So this gives them an opportunity to come in and say that we want to do something different with our lost revenues, so that their taxpayers get the full benefit of the property tax relief and get the full school tax relief. We didn't want to fashion a solution for everybody, but we'll let each legislator come up with how they wish to do it. It may be that you just want to repeal it outright. You may want to redirect it to county revenues, or you may want to redirect it to some other source. I did not want to get into telling you what you should or shouldn't send it to, but you will get the same property tax relief as everybody else. Section 2-1 will incorporate what the governor has proposed into this bill, and it will eliminate the state portion of the property taxes of 1/4 mil, except on state intangible taxes. We decided that the governor proposed that. We liked his idea. I think that's about a $90 million a year tax cut that he proposed. So we accepted it and placed it into this bill as a part of our property tax reform. Section 2-2 is the authorization for a refundable grocery income tax credit. Now, let me tell you how this works. When we first discussed putting the taxes back on groceries, instantly some people said, what about the old people and what about the poor people? It will disproportionately affect them. And so to take away that argument completely, initially I proposed, and I continue to propose, that we give a tax credit to anyone who is a Georgia resident, who fills out a Georgia individual income tax return, for the amount of grocery taxes they paid based upon a chart that we will set forth, and it is in the enabling legislation, the amount, but we just authorize this constitutionally. When I get to the enabling legislation, I'll go through the details of what you get, but essentially, if you're at above 50% of the poverty level, you get to take a credit based upon a chart up to 100%, and then beyond 100% of the poverty level, it starts decreasing. So that people who are at the poverty level or below will essentially will not be paying taxes on groceries if they fill out a Georgia tax return. Now, some have said to me, well, they may not fill out a Georgia tax return, and I simply say, well, they're required to, and they should. And if they will, we'll give them a refundable credit for the amount they pay in grocery taxes. The only way to get one of the problems with our tax policy is we have 9.5 million Georgians, but I'm firmly convinced we don't have 9.5 million Georgians paying taxes. There are too many people that are either illegally or improperly in this country that are not paying taxes. And the best tax for those people to pay is a sales tax, especially one on groceries. This proposal will have those people paying taxes on groceries, and if they're not legally in the United States, we know they're not going to fill out a Georgia income tax return, but if they do and report income and pay taxes on it, so be it. We get them in the system. Otherwise, we will have them as at least taxpayers in Georgia, and that is one of the goals of putting this provision in place. The next section, section 2-3, provides for motor vehicle tax relief grant system. Now that's the section I discussed with you earlier about how we will give property tax relief to every person in Georgia who has a car in their individual name. They say car or truck. A car or truck in their individual name will pay 0 property taxes effective January 1st, 2009 if the amendment passes. That part of the relief, the motor vehicles, is instantaneous. Section 3-1 through 3-4 remove the changes to the Constitution made in Part 1 of this resolution in a sunset provision. There are some people that think that let's lay this on the table. When we get to the fiscal notes, you'll see. We are going to have an aggressive system of collecting these taxes. I hope by giving the Department of Revenue 13 months from the date of implementation of the amendment that gives them plenty of time to get ready to start collecting the taxes. But if this system doesn't work, if collecting taxes on groceries, lottery tickets, and on personal service doesn't work, this constitutional amendment will sunset on December 31st, 2012. And the only way it'll be renewed is if the General Assembly, prior to December 31st, 2012, reenacts it. We will know if the revenues are coming in well before December 31st, 2012. If the revenues are coming in and we think this work, we'll re-up it. If we do not, if the revenues are not coming in, the provisions will sunset. The same is true for Section 4-1, sunset of the Homestead Tax Relief Grant. If it is a sunset provision for December 31st, 2012, and if we don't have the money coming in and renew this, then the provisions will be repealed. Section 5 is the constitutional question. The question reads, shall the Constitution of Georgia be amended so as to comprehensively reform the property tax system of Georgia to provide immediate property tax relief and to authorize future property tax relief by implementing the Property Tax Reform Amendment? We propose the amendment be placed on the November 2008 ballot. If it gets a majority vote, the provisions will be implemented. If it does not, the provisions do not take effect. In order to implement the provisions of the House resolution, we have to have enabling legislation. Sometimes people come forward with constitutional amendments, but without concurrent enabling legislation. I don't believe that's a wise idea in this case, and we have enabling legislation that will accompany this in the form of House Bill 979.
Mr. Speaker, could we maybe take questions on the resolution?
Absolutely.
Before you get into the bill, and
Absolutely.
So that we can keep them separate? I'm afraid they're going to bleed over into each other. And
okay.
So if you have a question regarding the resolution, now would be the proper time to mash your button, and I'll call on you.
But I think it's okay if they go back and forth. I think these are so intertwined, Mr. Chairman, that it's almost impossible not to talk about
them.
one without the other. But I'll be glad to talk about just the resolution and the general concepts now, if that's what you prefer.
Okay. I agree with you wholeheartedly in what you just said. Representative Sims, you waive?
I'll waive until he gets ready.
All right. Chairman O'Neill.
Just a couple of quick questions for clarification. When you were talking, Speaker, about Section 11B, or on page 4, about the motor vehicles, you said trucks and cars. My question was, what about motors? I mean, do motor vehicles cover all motor vehicles, like people that own motorcycles that pay?
I can't remember if we included motorcycles in the statute, did we? We put motorcycles. Where's John? Yes, we included. I'm sorry. We included all personal, passenger, and motorcycles.
Okay.
When I said trucks, I meant pickup type trucks, SUVs, anything personally owned. But it would not include commercially owned vehicles, or trailers, or buses.
Okay. And along that follow-up on that same line, where we have the elective benefit for those, you used the Cobb County example, taxpayers over 62 can elect the $30,000, up to the $30,000 credit, no, the $30,000 credit. Do they also get the personal vehicle benefit if they make that election? So
well,
they get both?
They'll get the personal vehicle. The over 62 exemption does not apply to personal property. It only applies to real property.
Right.
So, yes, they would get the personal property credit. And I don't know if $30,000 is the right number or not, but it's as close as we could get to getting what we thought would be constitutional authority up to $30,000. That would effectively mean, and I did this math several times in my head, I think that means that a house, that's an $80,000 house, would essentially pay no taxes whatsoever.
Right.
None. Already exempt from school tax, that would completely extinguish their entire tax bill for all property taxes.
I did the same math, and I do concur.
That was the number I was trying to work towards. We were first looking at 100,000, and I'll just be honest, it's a number that we picked that we thought we could afford. I know that there's a lot of houses valued at more than $80,000, but effectively it would mean an $80,000 house in one of those counties that has an over 62 would pay 0 school taxes and 0 county taxes. So we thought that was a very aggressive step forward in funding that proposal.
All right, Representative Abrams? Okay. Representative Knight?
Mr. Speaker, in regards to the counties that currently have the school exemption, I heard you say that as of January 1, 2008, that would be off the table going forward. What about counties that were getting ready and in the shape of their tax base had come up and they were getting ready to give those exemptions? Are we going to lock into maybe an unequitable situation of the counties have already done it versus now?
Well, that's a good question, Representative. You know, let me see if I can. I don't think so, and here's why. Is today, under the law that exists as we have it, we have a tax system where the people of a local area have decided that they want to give relief to a certain segment that are over a certain age, and they voted on it and approved it. This resolution, should you approve it, the House approves it, the legislature approves it, and the people approve it, would give relief to everybody from school taxes. But those people that are in those counties that are already having that school tax relief would get nothing out of this, and yet they would be asked to pay the additional sales tax. I think it would be unfair not to give them this relief. But going forward, since we now know this is the relief provided, I see no reason to allow other people to come into there and add to that and try to add to the cost to the state. And that's what it would be. Essentially, we're making everybody whole. If you're in a county that has no school tax now, we're making you whole. And if you're in a county that's paying school tax now, we're making you whole, so that all taxpayers, as of the ballot in 2008, will get virtually the identical same relief. Now, I have to say virtually, because if you have a very expensive house in one of those counties, you might not get quite as much tax relief as other people. But the only way we could do that is to really jack that $30,000 up, and that becomes a very expensive proposition. And we were trying to be as fair and equitable as possible. But I hope that answers your question. I don't think it creates a different situation. I think it creates a relief to everybody that's equitable as of November of 2008.
All right, Representative Flood, you recognized for a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, you used an example of a homeowner who might pay 0 taxes, but they would be exempt both from school taxes and get the taxpayer relief grant. What would be the net impact, if any, on local governments, not schools, but local governments, should this resolution pass?
None. They'll get the exact same amount of money they're getting today. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a house, and I take Cobb County because I know that. Person 65 years of age, the tax bill mails out, and it's $1,000. $500 for school, $500 for the county. Well, they get a credit on their school taxes for that $500, and so they only write a check for $500 now. Well, this would give them the homeowner tax relief grant, where the state would send the check for $500, and the county and school district would get to the penny what the tax bill indicated. So they were not only are they going to be made whole, but for the first time, we're going to provide, the state is going to require us in the Constitution to send to school districts the amount of the tax on the assessed value times the millage rate for every homestead in Georgia. This is a new thing, and there are the school districts are going to get what they bill. Now, I want to point out what we're going to get into in the enabling legislation, because I don't want anybody to start their wheels turning. There's some important things. This is a package, and what we're doing with the Senate has to be a package. we have to do some other things with property taxes to make this work. We have to freeze values on homesteads. We have to cap millage rates. And we have to put into the bill that the relief we're providing is based upon the millage rate in effect in 2007, or as of January 1st of 2008. And the reason why is we can't take a chance that a local jurisdiction would go raise their millage rate artificially to try and create a situation where they get a windfall from the state. But they will be guaranteed exactly what their tax bill would be if their millage rate is the same as it is this year, plus a cost of living. We'll give them the governmental increase in the cost of living. We're just not going to let them go jack the millage rates up and artificially create a windfall for themselves and a liability to the state.
Thank you. All right. Representative Graves, you recognize for a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could follow up on that, you mentioned the 2007 values. There are several counties in the state that are currently going through revaluations. They've hired contractors to do that for them. They're trying to get everybody back up to where they should be or make sure everything is right. Is there any accountability, accounting for that, or do they just sort of lose all the money they've spent on that?
That's a good question, Representative. And I think we touched that in, we're going to have to do that in the Senate resolution. I think what we've got to do is to freeze the values and get them right is we freeze the values as of 2008. The Senate did not. I don't know if the Senate did that or not. Didn't do it because I can't remember what we're working with. But the proposal that we're going to have for the Senate resolution is we freeze values as of 2008 to allow for all those counties that are doing that. If you don't know in Georgia by now that we're talking about doing something about property taxes, you probably shouldn't be in office. So it's time to get the values up, and I think we ought to use the 2008 values for the base mark of this whole thing. Now, what I can't do, and it troubles me a little bit to say this, but I'm not sure I can trust local government to say 2008 millage rates. In light of the way they've reacted to all of this, I'm afraid if we said the 2008 millage rate, which they get to set, that there might be one or more that would artificially raise a millage rate so that they could try to seek extra windfall from it. So I would lock them at their millage rate of 07 at that or a lesser rate. Because if they raise the values, their millage rate theoretically should go down to keep them even. But if they raise the values and raise the millage rate, it'll cost the state extra money. And so 08 values is what I would propose to the committee makes sense. Let notice be served to every county in Georgia. If you have values that are inequitable, now is the time to adjust them. You should have already done it. Equity and uniformity should have been what you're doing. But if you're behind on that, get them up to speed. But notice also should be served, don't be thinking about raising your millage rates to get a windfall. We're not going to allow that either.
Great, and I agree with that. And the appeal process hopefully will protect them from going too far outside of where they should have been. But
hopefully,
I appreciate you allowing that. That's good.
No, I think that's a good point. And listen, when we get to the Senate proposal, it's impossible not to talk about these together. And Senator Rogers is now here. We've worked closely together. What we worked on was not exactly what finally came out of the Senate, but it's okay. This is a work in progress. Let me tell you what I think needs to happen to make that really good. I think we ought to tell homeowners we can cap your values at 2% a year, and we'll talk about the business in a minute. But if all we're going to do is cap homeowners' values and not cap millage rates, we might as well do nothing. It is absolutely useless to cap values and not cap millage rates. Now, the capital millage rates that I propose to put in the Senate resolution will have an escape clause that allow every governmental entity to raise their millage rate above the inflation rate if their local citizens approve it in a referendum. And it's just that simple. We essentially will be limiting local governments from increasing by more than the rate of inflation unless their citizens vote to do it by majority vote. And I just wanted to say that in conjunction with the values, because the Senate actually froze the values of businesses. And if you don't know this, they froze residential properties at 2% a year. this? Is this some?
Someone could hit the light,
Oh, I thought
leaning
you
on
were
the
doing-
light in the back of the room.
thought you were
Somebody's
giving me a
leaning on the
signal.
light.
I went, wow, that's good. I thought, James, you're really good.
That-
They froze
That'd be
resident-
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Former Chairman. Okay, all right, that's pretty good. I'll tell you what. Don't get in a battle of wits with Chairman James Mills. He'll win. They froze the values of residential properties at 2% and business properties at 3%, and I think that is a great step to let taxpayers know that there's not going to be a backdoor tax increase. But sometimes it's not the backdoor tax increases that we need to worry about it as much as the front door tax increases, and I think citizens ought to vote to approve those.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Sims, you recognize for a question.
Mr. Speaker, with the 2% or 3% rise with those caps, who's going to pay that cost when it does rise?
We would allow them to rise. First of all, the values will go up, and the millage rate is authorized to go up at the rate of inflation.
I understand, but who pays them, though?
The taxpayers pay it.
That
as it
would be
goes up.
commercial property and non-residential, the residential property that is not homestead. Is that correct?
There's two. The Senate did 2% on residential property, 3% cap on non-residential property.
I understand. But
It won't increase more than that on value.
Okay, but the taxpayer, the one that has to actually pay that, even though if it goes up, say in 2011, 2012, if it goes up to 2% or 3%, that tax will still be allotted to that commercial property and the non-homesteaded residential property. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. That's one more.
But let me make sure. But the credit that we're offering here goes up every year.
I understand.
Yeah, they'll get more. We're going to let. We recognize that the cost of government goes up. One of the frustrating things about this whole process was people that would have houses, and I don't even want to state a zip code or area, but there are people that have houses in Georgia that they've owned them for a long time, and the value just keeps going up and up and up, and that's the tax value. Well, that sounds really good, except for this: the property's not for sale. It was somebody's home or their family business, and yet it's going up because of other factors, and it was causing them to pay a disproportionately higher burden of taxes. And if you approve the Senate resolution, you're simply recognizing that once you buy a property, there's a cap as to how much it'll go up. Now, when you sell it or you improve it or anything like that, it'll go to fair market value. But we recognize that the cost of government will go up at the rate of inflation, and I can't remember that rate for the last year. What was the governmental rate? Was it 4% a year? 4% is a pretty healthy increase. And when you add that with the values that go up, there'll be enough money for extra services for local governments.
All right, got a couple more questions. Representative Lewis, you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, while we're on the subject of property values, it just occurred, if we're talking about if all this passes in conjunction and we have a frozen value on property or there's a very limited assessment increase, will this allow for or take into account falling values, like we're in a depressed housing market now?
Representative, that's a good question. For the first time in this state, we may actually see values decline in some areas. It'll allow for that. It's a prohibition upon it rising, not more than 2% in any 1 year. Now, let me just point something out about language. It would let it go down, but the Senate language, we've cleaned up a little bit. I'm not sure exactly who got their spin in there, but they had it fixed so that you could stack the 2%. I don't even know if they realized it. We're saying in any one tax year, it will not go up by any more than 2%. That would not prohibit it from going down. It just won't go up by any more. It's a good question as to whether it'll be interesting to see. And y'all know my background. I've been involved in county government for years. It will be forever. County governments were so anxious to revalue properties because we were, blowing and going. Everything was going up, and they said, everybody knows values are going up. Everybody knows values are going up. And so we just kept pulsing them up and up and up. it will be interesting to see if counties across the state are as anxious to take values down as they were to take them up.
Right. Well, if I just want to follow up along those lines, based on what was asked earlier about some counties currently doing some evaluations right now in a depressed market, I would have to assume that some of those evaluations right now would come in less than what they were 1 or 2 years ago.
Well, I would think so. The market conditions are such now they're sort of depressed, and it may be a temporary market. And Representative, here's the other truism, though. Oftentimes, if a house is on the market for $100,000, oftentimes that was not the tax assessed value. It was not unusual, even with all of the studies, for tax assessed value to be at least 10 to 15% below actual market value. So here's the question. Will that simply close the gap? I will think so, and I doubt if you'll see massive revaluations that lower digest, but you may see some individual parcels, and I wouldn't be surprised to see people that are in properties, they go appeal them and say, this property sold for 100, it's been foreclosed at 80, and now it won't sell for 70.
Thank you.
All right. 26, is that Representative Royal? Sorry, Representative Royal recognized for question.
Mr. Speaker, I want to make sure I understand you now. As we calculate these tax adjustments, as we move forward, you've got a 2007 taxable year base. As millages increase, is the adjustment amount going to increase too if it stays within the constitutional limits of the Senate amendment?
I think there's maybe millage rates and values are going to be a little different. The values would be capped at 2% per year on the residential. The millage would be capped at an increase of not more than the previous year's governmental inflation rate, which last year was about 4. It would change from year to year, whatever the previous year's governmental inflation rate. That number does go up and down. I mean, it probably fluctuates a point, a half a point to.
It's about 100 basis points above CPI. Typically, has been for about the last 13 years.
That's tax lawyers for it's 1 point above the consumer price index. It is. That's a good tax law, 100 basis points. But it would go up and down every year. And now that's not to say that a government has to go up that entire amount. But that would be the limit that they could go up without a referendum at one of the referendum dates.
Well, I guess I'm talking more or less about the tax relief. I'm looking on page 3 of the constitutional amendment on lines 4. Any additional tax liability attributable to a millage rate in excess of the base millage rate used for the purposes of calculating such benefit shall not be eligible for the tax relief provided by this adjustment amount.
That's not the cap on what the governments do. It's the cap on what we're limited in paying at the state level. Let me see if I can clarify this. It is possible that we freeze the values, cap the millage rate, and I could see a public relations effort to go in that says, hey, your values are frozen, but if we raise your millage rate, it really won't cost you anything because the state will just pay it. And I actually think it may have been Representative Scott that initially pointed, he's shaking his head, I think he pointed that out to us early on in early conversations. And at first I said, nobody would do that. And then I thought, well, they might. And so the purpose of this is to cap the amount of relief we get so that a true statement would be if a governmental entity went to the citizens and said, we wish to raise taxes, by the way, you will have to pay it all, so that they can't go to them and say, we're going to raise taxes, but you won't have to pay any of it. That would be that would limit our liability, and that's the purpose of that provision, is to limit us so that if they go up more than the rate of inflation, they don't get that additional tax relief. They'll only get the millage rate plus the governmental inflation rate increase.
So it will include an increase, is what you're saying?
It does include an increase. It'll go up every year.
Thank you, Representative Roy. All right, we've got 2 more questions. I'm going to take these last 2 questions on the resolution, then we'll move on into the bill. We've spent almost half our time on the resolution. We really need to get into the meat of the bill. Representative Roberts, you recognize for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess this goes back to the Senate bill, but just, Mr. Speaker, you brought it up a while ago, and you was talking about the freeze and the property values. When they done an addition, that would then be assessed at the current value. Is it only the addition that will be assessed as that, or will it take the whole, the house or whatever, up to the current assessed value?
For some reason, I'm sorry. Would you say that again? I didn't follow that.
Yeah, the construction addition. If you,
I believe I need to. I can't remember if we did that as a split or a revaluation or just the improvement. Do you? All right. It's council. We had this conversation. Let's so everybody understands it. If you have a house valued at $100,000, you go build one bedroom onto it. Does that cause the whole property to be revalued or just the addition to be revalued? We believe that we have written that so that it's just the addition to be revalued.
That's what I thought. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Roberts. Representative Rice, you recognize for question.
Mr. Speaker, on page 2, the homeowners incentive adjustment for the Cobb, Gwinnett, and others that already have a senior exemption.
I forgot Gwinnett was in there, but thank you for reminding me.
Well, that's a needs-tested one, so I think your $80,000 will cover that very adequately, as a matter of fact, from that standpoint. But the on line 29, the $30,000 assessed value exemption, line 29.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering, these are fixed numbers, and I'm wondering if in fact, if we're allowing for increases in the millage rate as well as the valuation, whether this should not in some way float.
Well, the way the current HTRG works is the current constitutional language says a homestead exemption of up to $18,000. It's determined by the General Assembly, though, what we fund. We, to this day, on HTRG, only fund $8,000. So we knew we had $10,000 to play. We took that to $30,000. I mean, to be honest with you, we could put $50,000. The key is what we fund. And if I can't remember why we decided to stay. Is there any real reason? It was just a decision by us to stay at something that was within reason. If the committee wants to have constitutional authority to raise that, you can. But I think we've got enough flexibility in there that let me consider that. I don't think I have any real preference if we raise. It wouldn't hurt anything if it's raised. It's all in the statute what we fund.
Okay.
Thank you. If we could just for a minute, we want to officially recognize Senator Rogers. Appreciate you coming to be a part of these deliberations. Mr. Speaker, at this time, if we could, there are no more questions, but we move forward into the implementation legislation, which would be the substitute to House Bill 979. It should be in all the committee members' folders, and we'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I'm operating off LC 187131S. Section 1-1 provides what the current law is, and that is that the state portion of the property tax will only be levied in emergencies to coincide with the elimination of the property tax. That is actually just a state protection that's out there in case there's an emergency that we'll put in there. It would take an act of this General Assembly to do that. Section 1-2, this institutes the $20 annual fee per vehicle. Since we're taking all taxes off all vehicles, we thought that we should have some revenue source recognizing the keeping up with the tags, the instruments, the vehicles, and put it on there. And we also want to put that in there as the $10 of which shall be designated for the Georgia Trauma Trust Fund. Again, that's not so far as to put this in the constitutional amendment to tag the revenue. The governor and I have both talked about that. We both have some reluctance to tag any more revenue. But I think the will of the General Assembly is to fund trauma care, and here is the money that's going to come flowing in. That is about $72 million a year. Section 1-3 is the income tax credit for sales taxes paid on groceries. That's what I discussed with you earlier. The chart starts on page 3, but what it simply does is this. If you fill out a Georgia individual income tax and return, and you have an income of from zero to 50% of the poverty level, you get up to 50%. So regardless of your income, if you have zero income, you pay grocery taxes. You get 50% of the food expense. And then from that point on, we took it 51%, we took it 100%. Now then, we can have lots of conversations about where you draw this line. But essentially, we drew the line at 50% of the poverty level and said when you get beyond 50%, you get 100% of the food expense all the way up to 100% of the poverty level. Any way you change that line costs more money back and forth. There are some people that ask me, why are you doing this? And I said, well, I do not wish to have a disproportionate effect on people that are at or about the poverty level. This is solely and exclusively designed to take care of the elderly and the people at the poverty level, and it will give them a dollar-for-dollar credit according to those percentages. It does start to phase out when you get above the poverty level, and by the time you get to 199% of the poverty level, it's down to 10%, and at 200% of the poverty level, you no longer get the credit. It's just a decision as to where you put that. Section 1-4 is the implementation of tax on lottery and gross sales tax and groceries, period. I do want to point out again to you that when we in 1996 voted to take the tax off of groceries, that was estimated to cost the state $520 million in revenue. And I don't mind telling you, I have a different memory on how this vote took place, but I went and looked at it, and I actually thought I was here when the vote took place. I think maybe we were looking at it. The years start to come together. But I remember having a conversation with then Governor Zell Miller, where I tried to convince him that the better way to do this was not to exempt groceries from sales tax, but to let people who file Georgia individual income tax returns claim a credit for what they paid in grocery tax. Because I suspected then, as I do now, there's a lot of people that buy groceries that don't fill out tax returns. And frankly, I think it's time for them to contribute to part of the cost of government. And then Governor Zell Miller told me it was too complicated to do that. I do remember the conversation. I thought it was in conjunction with the vote. It obviously wasn't, since I looked and the vote occurred before that. But I think that still would be the best policy, and that's essentially what we're doing for low-income people. But the best place to do this is to tax the groceries at the store and let people pay incrementally as they go for government rather than get a big tax bill. Section 1-5 is the motor vehicle tax relief that we discussed. This section provides for the distribution of funds by the state to the counties, municipalities, and school districts to fund the credit for each taxpayer gets for each motor vehicle in an individual name. Now, if we weren't already doing this, I would think this would be a difficult proposition. I mean, really. But we're already doing this in the homeowner tax relief grant. We already put it in place and for homeowners, and we can do it for car owners. It will just be a matter of implementation. When the digest is submitted with the vehicles, I'll let Revenue decide if they want to do it on a monthly or quarterly basis, however they want to do it. They just write a check to the counties, who then distribute the money to the schools and the cities for the taxes owed, all taxes owed on all personal autos. So that from now on, when it becomes your birthday, all you know for sure is you've got to get a tag and pay the tag fee, but you don't have to pay taxes. It is the first step towards changing our system from one that taxes based on added value to one that taxes on sales. Section 2-1 is the next section. And this section is a very lengthy section. It's the taxation of services. Now, We've talked about this a long time. If you want to change a system of ad valorem taxation to fund government, you have to tax something else, and you have to broaden the base. We need more people paying on the little stuff that has to do with consumption if you want to change from ad valorem taxes. When we first proposed this, we proposed essentially a value-added tax, and that was the way this whole thing started, was to do a VAT. Businesses, I think, overreacted. I've heard more people tell me that they'll go out of business in Georgia if we were to tax services than I care to list. In fact, it's quite amazing to me at the business people who have any finger in any part of this tax that say that they'll never do business in Georgia if we change a single thing. You know, I don't believe that. I believe it's time to change this idea of taxation and get to taxing consumption. Taxing personal services is step one in the process of taxing consumption. And that's what this is designed to do. Now, you can say, well, what if we don't want to do that? And I'm going to tell you it's pretty simple. If you don't want to do that, you go to the fiscal note. You turn to the last page of the fiscal note. If you don't want to tax services, you take away $692.6 million in FY11, and either you provide an extra $700 million in tax cuts, or you take away $700 million from property owners on the relief we're going to give them on their school taxes, or you put the taxes back on the cars. It is a $692.6 million revenue source in FY11. What we try to do in Section 2-1 and 2-2 is outline what those services are. Let me clarify what is not taxed and what is not included in there. Services for individual taxpayers, more than $10,000 per taxpayer per vendor per year. Medical services, child care services, education services, services provided by business to business. Other than that, it was our attempt and our intention to include all other personal services, and to that extent, we included, beginning on page 16, a list of all the services. During these hearings and processes, there was concern as what would or would not be included. So we included with the NAICS code, the North American Industry Classification System code, every service that we intend to tax between two individuals. It is as an exhaustive of a list as we could come up with, and we propose it to this committee. Now, the good thing about this is if you agree with the concept of going forward, and if you agree with this list, we can go forward, and if you start thinking about it and something else should be included or something should not be included, this time next year, after the taxpayers have implemented it, we can change the list. In fact, I suggest that just like we update the annual drug list, we update the annual service list to make sure that we're taxing personal services at the state rate. The state rate. The counties and cities and schools did not indicate they wished to tax services. So this rate is only the state rate of 4%, or whatever the state rate may be. It's 4% now, and that's what it would be. And it'll be collected and paid to the state. I predict with certainty that no sooner do we get this implemented than counties and cities and schools will say, well, miraculously, we ought to get in on some of that tax money. We don't get that. And if they do, then we can decide if we let them in, and if we do, we ought to do it in the name of giving additional property tax relief. You see, the same people that will be paying the services are the property owners, or at least a portion of them are. We go on with list after list after list. As you see, they go on through page 21 with 174 other categories. Now then, there are some services that we currently tax. I know that was a surprise to me when I heard that. I didn't know that, but we do, and I always forget how it reads. It says it's on the rental or lease of tangible personal property. Well, that's code for a lot of things. It includes limousine rentals and car rentals and tangible personal property. We already tax those today. We're not going to add a tax on a tax. But we're also not going to take, because those are already taxed, they're already taxed at the state and the local level, we're not going to take that away either. So, to the extent there's any overlap, if they're listed, we've got catch-all language that says, to the extent it's already being taxed, doesn't mean that they pay less tax and they're not excluded from this list. It's just to make certain that we covered that category. That's it on services. Section 2-3 is a credit for franchise fees paid by cable providers. Currently today, if you buy cable TV, every jurisdiction in the state charges a franchise fee. The cable company puts it on your bill, collects it from you, pays it to the county entity. We believed in preparing this that was a personal, that is a tax on services, and therefore we shouldn't tax that twice. In other words, if you're already paying a tax to the cable company for a franchise fee, we weren't going to tax that again. So the way we wrote this is, you will either pay the franchise fee or the tax, whichever is greater, but not both. Now then, there's been some discussions by people that in the satellite industry that somehow that gives favoritism to the cable industry. But you're not paying a franchise fee to satellite providers. So I do not understand why you would give a credit to them. We simply thought it was a matter of equity to consumers, that consumers shouldn't pay a tax in the form of a franchise fee to a cable provider and pay a tax on the service. So, we chose to provide the relief to the cable provider consumers, and that's how the language reads, is to the extent they get the credit, they have to pass it to the consumer so that they can't just let it go. And I think, I'll leave that to the wisdom of the committee, but I can't imagine why you wouldn't provide that tax to consumers so that they only pay one tax for cable service. Section 2-4 is the homestead tax relief. This section provides the detail for the grant of the funds to school districts through the homeowner tax relief grant system in the exact amount as the tax that is on the bill, to the penny. Any school system, first of all, let me say this. I have been embarrassed by the misinformation that some of our most educated citizens have tried to put out about this bill. It truly is sad. And the hysteria and hype that have been put out by people with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, doctoral degrees, that somehow this is going to cost them money. It is not going to cost a school district 1 penny. Not 1 penny. They will get exactly, when they sit down and make their budget and they decide what the digest is and their millage rate and say this is how much money we need, that's how much they get. It's just that we're going to give relief to their taxpayers that they weren't willing to give to them. We're going to give the relief at the state level. We'll write the relief grant to them, and we will send it to the taxpayers, but we'll never actually exchange a check. It'll just be a bill to the taxpayer for $1,000 worth of school tax, and we'll pay it. If it's $1,200, we'll pay it. If it's $5,000 worth of school tax, we pay it. Whatever it is, we pay it. But we're capping it at the millage rate that's in effect now or a lesser rate plus inflation. And hopefully we'll cap the values to slow down the rate of growth. I do not understand why any school system in the state of Georgia would say they have any issue with trying to provide property tax relief to property taxpayers. But if you say you're now against this, you're against giving those property owners tax relief, because that's what this does, to the penny. And again, we're not reinventing the wheel. A lot of conversation about the homeowner tax relief grant, but we do it, we implement it. It costs about $420 or $30 million a year, and this will work the same way. The only difference is we'll keep the HTRG for those counties like Cobb, Gwinnett, and the 5 or 6 others that have an over 62 exemption. The next section, section 3-1, is the section where we implement the property value freeze. And I believe this is in conjunction with the Senate resolution. This is in conjunction with the Senate resolution that freezes the values. And as I discussed with you earlier, this is Senate Resolution 796. It provides real property value relief at 2008 values, as we discussed with Representative Graves a while ago, with the exception of the 2% annual increase for residential properties and 3% for non-residential. Now, let me tell you what I've tried to clarify. I didn't like the way the Senate version read. I read the Senate version. I'll let the committee decide this. No, it's okay, Senator. I didn't mean bad. I read it to say 2% per taxable year, meaning that you could sit and not revalue a property for 5 years and come along and have 2% a year and raise it 10%. That was not my intentions. My intentions were, if they want to have a system of revaluing the property every year, then they could do it up to a maximum of 2% per year. But you can't save them those 2 points for 4 years and then add 10 points to a house. If you want to do it, keep the values current. And here's what I say about that. You know good and well that somebody right now is working on a program to write it to raise values of homestead 2% a year. And that's exactly what they'll do. But I was scared that if you let them save them up, that somebody might save them up for 6, 7, 8, 10 years and all of a sudden come in and your value's up 20%. And you get hit with a big tax increase and you didn't even know it. And I think it ought to read clearly, in any tax year, not more than 2%. And if you can't figure out a way to draft a program of characterizing values so that it goes up not more than 2% a year, you probably shouldn't be doing this. But I assure you they can write that program and fix that, and we're allowing them to do that. The same would be true for business properties. Now, initially when I'm going to take this head on. Initially when I talked about this, I did not think that we should freeze non-residential properties. I guess maybe I didn't have that within my framework. Here was my thought processes, and I'm not arguing against it. I want to lay you both arguments out there so you can decide. A homeowner who buys a home buys it for a place for shelter and a place for their family to live. And they have no ability to pick up the extra money if they don't get a raise or have some other source of money if the value of their home goes up and their tax liability goes up. And while business does not always have the opportunity to pass it along, as a general rule, as a very general, business has the opportunity, if their taxes go up, to pass it along. Homeowners have no one to pass it along to except to take it deeper out of their pocket or cut something back at their houses. That's why I had never thought about business properties. Now, I'm not opposed to it. I think it's a good consideration for businesses that business now can predict that their taxes won't go up more than the rate of inflation and their value won't go up more than 3%. And so I'm telling you, I think it's a good proposition. It's a good idea, and we ought to do it. But I wanted you to see both sides of it. I didn't initially do that. And when we started talking about it, I said, I don't disagree with giving this protection to business. I just think that it will gender a little more conversation about whether we should do that. And that's up to the wisdom of this committee in the House. The last provision, Section 4-1, is the effective dates, and it's, as I suggested to you now, the relief for the carts to get rid of the tag tax. Y'all remember, I think Guy Milner was doing that. Somebody did that, axe the tag tax. We'll be axing the tag tax if the voters approve this January 1st, 2009. So if you have a birthday on December 31st, 2008, you'll pay you'll have to pay the tax on your car. If you have your birthday January 1st, 2009, you no longer will have taxes on your car. No taxes on any car in 2009. But you will start paying in January 1st, 2009, taxes on groceries and taxes on lottery tickets. You will not pay services tax until January 1st of 2010. Again, to let everybody understand it, have an educational effort, we're going to start doing this January of 10 and put in place. And then in 10, you'll get the relief of your property taxes for schools, so that property owners all over Georgia, maybe 2 million homeowners all over Georgia, will see their property tax bills cut in half. I maybe ought to say that again. 2 million property owners over Georgia, if they vote for this, will see their property tax bills cut in half with the elimination of the school tax through the funding of this mechanism by the grocery tax, lottery tax, and services tax. Now you have before you, and I think it needs to be talked about this bill, the fiscal note. Fiscal note, Mr. Hinton has done a really good job analyzing the data from Georgia State. Earlier when I was talking about data, I was talking about the professor at Georgia State that did the data. I am not going to engage in an intellectual discussion over the data. I'm just not going to do it, other than to say I think that it has some biases in it. I think it might be a tad higher than it really is. And I think a little more money will come in than is shown here. But assuming the data is correct, if you turn the last page, in fiscal year 2009, the way this implements is there's initially a revenue increase of $116.5 million. In 10, there's initially, these are fiscal years. And remember, we're not implementing this until halfway through fiscal 2009, so you won't get, that's why it shows initially a revenue increase. 10 does the same thing, a revenue increase of $288.3. And then in 2011, FY 2011, which will begin July 1st, 2010, is when the full effect will kick in, $826.9 million cut in revenue for a total over 3 years of $422.1 million. This bill is a comprehensive reform of taxes with one of the largest tax cuts that this body has ever taken up, of $422 million in taxes. I believe that we can sustain it. I believe we should, and I believe the property owners of this state demand it. I'll be glad to submit to any questions, Mr. Chairman, on House Bill 979.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You've done a fine job in presenting this bill, and I know it's been long.
I got as much time as y'all want me here.
All right. At this time, we'll recognize Representative Roberts for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, from the school standpoint, a lot of them are claiming we currently don't adequately fund education. Of course, I know it's debatable what adequately funding education is. They talk about that we're guaranteed to do it now. Well, under this plan, it says that we're guaranteed to do it, but what is their promise? I mean, I agree with you that it's a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Well, there's no constitutional authority now for us to give them a certain amount of money. It just says adequate funding. Under this proposal, for the first time in Georgia, for the first time, we would be constitutionally mandated to give school districts in Georgia this amount of money. And if you look at the fiscal note, the amount of money that will go to the schools is somewhere in 2011. The credit for school property tax on homestead is $1.9 billion. Now, I don't know what math classes anybody's taken in the past. But if you have a guarantee of zero today in local dollars, and we guarantee you we're going to back up your local property taxes to the tune of $1.9 billion, I can't imagine why you wouldn't agree to that. The other issue, Representative Roberts, is this whole adequacy of funding. This has nothing to do with this concept of property taxes. There's two separate animals here. There's the state component and there's the local component. I think it's worth pointing out that many of those school districts hollering the loudest are a plaintiff in a lawsuit contending that the system that they're so violently trying to protect is unconstitutional. It just seems incomprehensible to me that an educated person can file a suit contending that the system is inadequate, and then when you try to change it, contend that what you're changing it to violates the Constitution they say is unconstitutional. I don't know how they're teaching our children. That's inconsistent with logic and reason. It is inconsistent with logic and reason. The system we have in place is at best a marginal system. We have got to gravitate away from this. This system today will have nothing to do with state funding. We will still have to make the tough decisions in this body, and I anticipate, based on my conversations with the Chairman of Appropriations, we will restore the austerity cuts to education from state dollars. That has nothing to do with the local dollars, but this bill has to do with the local dollars that we're going to replace that property owners are paying today. School districts will get exactly what they vote on to receive in the meeting. They will get it all. There is zero cuts to them. It is constitutionally mandated. And here's the real interesting point that this body needs to consider. What if the money doesn't come in? Guess what? We have to pay it anyway. Under this proposal, with the fiscal note you have, it's a $422 million cut. If the money doesn't come in because we don't do a good job of going out and getting ready to get that money in, we still have to pay the local school systems. Your protection is that we sunset it in 2012. So it would have an effect in 10, 11, and 12. By then, we'll know if it's working. And if it's working, I hope we do more of it. And if it's not working, I'll be the first to raise my hand and say, it doesn't work. We can't collect enough money to do it. We got to go back to the property taxpayers to pay for this. But I predict for you this, by the time we get to that day, we will already have a decision on the Georgia Supreme Court that tells us if the system of funding education in Georgia is constitutional or not. And if the Supreme Court does as I suspect, as they have in like 20-some other states, we better have a procedure in place to change it in a hurry. This will give us that ability.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Peake, you recognize for
Thank you, Mr.
question.
Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just one comment and then maybe a technical question if I can, too.
Sure.
I've been a strong proponent since this came out of reforming property taxes in our system, so thank you. I applaud you for taking that on. And more than anything, I know you've been getting a lot of questions from us and from all over the state, and I appreciate your response to maybe backing off a little bit and taking it a slower step. I think that's a smart thing, and so I appreciate that. One of the things we continued to hear, and back in our homes, was when we initially started this process was we're losing local control. We're losing local control, and I know you just addressed it in answering Representative Roberts, but I want to make sure everybody knows in this committee and everybody listening, the media, the whole works, that you would address that issue head on, because the way I understand it is, as you just said just a minute ago, we're going to pay school boards exactly what they set, what they control is the millage rate for their community.
We are not changing local control, we're expanding local control. Because for the first time in the history of the state, we're going to guarantee the property tax bills to a certain limit. Right now, today, if a school system sends out a tax bill and the taxpayer doesn't pay, there's remedies, but there's no guarantee they get the money. For the first time, we're creating a state obligation to pay that portion of the property tax bill to the schools. They're getting a $2 billion guarantee that they don't have today. The only thing I think they can complain about is one that they'll have to take to their local citizens, and that's this. They say they need to raise the amount of money they're bringing in. If they say they have to raise it greater than the rate of inflation, when you add to that the increased values, we are telling them they can't do that unless our citizens say we want to pay more taxes. That is the ultimate local control. I know they're elected, but under this system of elected citizens to do property taxes, we went from property tax revenues in 06 of $8.2 billion to 07 of $9.7 billion. Property taxes in Georgia in 1 year rose $1.5 billion with the system we have in place. Property taxpayers paid that. And I say it's time to bring that to a halt. If you want to raise more revenue than the rate of inflation plus the increase in the values, that ought to be plenty with the extra construction going on. But if you want to raise it more, because the citizens of your jurisdiction want this better, fill in the blank. Everybody says, why our people want better blank? Then I'm sure they'll approve this question. Shall taxes be raised in blank county by X amount? And that is the ultimate local control that you can have over a system of taxation.
Can I follow?
Yes.
Question. And if we could take you to page 3 of the implementing legislation, not the resolution.
Okay.
In discussing it with some other representatives, I want to make sure that we didn't miss something in this. And again, I think providing the tax credit back to those of our citizens that make the less amount of money is a proper thing to do. But I want to make sure. I've got a 21-year-old daughter. Let's say she makes $6,000 a year working in my restaurant during the year. She would receive 100% of the credit, which equates to about $90. If you calculate it all the way down for a single person, if you play the math out, it equates to about $90. My concern is that we may have opened a little bit of loophole here for those who are dependents of someone else to file a tax return just to get $90 credit. And so I guess
I'm not opposed to you saying a taxpayer not otherwise claimed as a dependent on another tax return.
Okay, I think that's the easy answer. Yes, sir. I believe
that may be one of the best catches. I thought we'd called everything. You know, it just goes to show you how this. I actually worried. I was worried about people gaming this a little bit, and I had thought about that system, but I don't think it's our intention to let somebody who's a dependent, even though you might have a tax liability, to also get this as well. But I'd be the wisdom of the committee. I think that would be a good place to put that on line 7. A taxpayer not otherwise claimed as a dependent. I would let council tell me if that's the place to put it, but that would be something the committee would have to decide. I think that's a good catch.
Okay. I'd love for my 19 and 21-year-old to get a $90 check from the state to pay for their gas, but I'm not sure that's the intention of where we were heading here.
I still pay for my 19, 20, and 20-something-year-olds gas.
Mr. Speaker, and how would that work on the opposite end of the spectrum with a widow or a widower who might be in a nursing home? same situation.
I don't know if a widow is claimed as a dependent on someone else's tax return. I think that's the answers. I'll let.
Right. They won't have any grocery expense, and they won't have any income.
I understand, but they'll get to claim it if they file a tax return. There will be people that will file a tax return that spend nothing on groceries or virtually. It's hard to say they don't spend anything. Representative, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to say. Well, in trying to be fair in this, you're going to get some unfairness, and in trying to be too fair, you can overanalyze this. It is what it is. It was my attempt to answer the critics' question of putting tax back on groceries on how it would affect those that are at the poverty level and those that are elderly. And I just chose to take that off the table. I did not want to hear because I believe there'll be well more than enough money generated to take care of those people. The fiscal note indicates that costs us
$180 million.
$180 million a year. I didn't know he jacked it up that high. It started off, the first time I asked him, he said it was $100 million. And if I ask him to do it one more time, and I'm not talking about Mr. Hinton or Mr. Childress, I'm talking about the Georgia State professor. If he does it one more time, it'll be $200 million, I'm sure, because he doesn't think we should do this. But that is a really high number. I don't believe it'll cost us $179 million. Again, I can show you the documents the first time we presented this where they wrote $100 million. They wrote it down, and now that's $179 million. So maybe a little more. That some of that's related to changing that, some of that's related to, as the majority used to say, I guess, later information.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly we want to reach out to that segment of our society when we're talking about widows and widowers. Mr. Speaker, if I could, I wanted to ask you a question myself about, I live in, of course, a district that has its own unique opportunities, but I've gotten some calls regarding the elimination of ad valorem tax on motor vehicles. Was there any thought given to using the same line of a requirement, that is, that if you file your income tax, you didn't get that, because we have a number of people who live in our communities and they may be here not legally, and that's the only tax that some people feel like they pay is their ad valorem on vehicle.
The idea that would be another idea. Let me tell you why I think the idea came from, giving the relief on motor vehicles. There are a lot of people who will be paying the taxes on groceries, lottery tickets, and personal services who don't actually own a home and pay direct taxes. For example, renters who would not otherwise be getting the school tax credit. And one of our thoughts was we needed to provide relief to those people too. And the easiest place to provide that relief was on their cars. Now then, while clearly there will be some people that many of us think are not deserving, that will basically get a break and not pay car taxes, there's I think a larger number of Georgians that might be in that category that'll get a break. So it was an effort by us to be equitable and fair. If we're going to reshuffle the deck on how we collect tax money, and that's what this is. It's a reshuffling the deck from one that taxes objects to one that taxes consumption. And if we're going to do that, we need to be consistent by not taxing objects, personal property, cars. Could we do that in a tax credit on off your tax return? I'm sure we can. I don't know what it would take to draft that, but it's like I think that would be a much more difficult step to go to, and it's just easier for us to take it off and pay it and say we're not going to have, you don't have to pay taxes on your car. Now I will point out one thing that on that subject, just for people that might be listening. People that are illegally in the United States that go and pay taxes on a car ought to be showing they've got insurance on those cars. And if they're not, they shouldn't be getting their tag, period. Somewhere in this process of netting out and making sure that everybody that's here working is paying, we need to tighten the screws down on that process. But I think it's something you could discuss, but I believe the better policy is to provide it to everybody. There will be people that live in apartments that get relief that aren't filling out. They're above the poverty level and they're not going to fill out an individual income tax return and itemize. They're just going to keep going. And we wanted to provide relief across the board.
Thank you. I realize that's complex, and I also think that I know that at least your intent, and mine is too, is to make sure that the tax breaks come to legal citizens.
That's my entire intent.
Representative Abrams, you're recognized for a question. Representative Abrams, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple of questions on the taxation services, but to follow up on the conversation about the grocery credits, do we know whether and I asked this I think at a previous hearing, will the credit impact eligibility for TANF relief for food or for Social Security, meaning that if someone receives this credit, it somehow constitutes income for them under either of those two government federal programs? And do we know what that impact might be?
Well, I can't imagine how it would be income to them to offset tax liability.
Well, my concern is that for a number, we have a threshold level both on the state and federal level for filing of income tax because you really don't, you fall below the exemption, the personal exemption level, so you don't actually usually generate sufficient income to pay personal income tax. So the only way these persons would be able to get the relief that they need from this credit would be to file taxes in a way they normally don't. My concern is whether or not we've analyzed under federal law whether or not these credits, and I'm not certain of the answer.
What is the amount of money you can earn to earn TANF?
It's a percentage of the. It's usually about. It's depending on
several $100s a month, though, isn't it? I mean, this whole credit boils down to maybe. I mean, we're talking about a couple $100 a year. But if you're at the poverty level, that'd be less than $20 a month. I can't imagine that would affect your ability to have TANF benefits. The only thing it might do is flesh out somebody that's on TANF benefits that's not filling out a tax return, and we catch their Social Security number in the system and find out that they did have some income.
What I'm requesting, and maybe this is to council, if we could get that information. I requested that earlier and would like to make sure that that isn't an issue.
We obviously, if someone is on the bubble on that income level, I guess it's possible $200 could push them over. But since I don't know what the income level is, I mean, if someone knows the income level to qualify, I can't imagine it. Does anybody? It's got to be thousands of dollars a year.
Threshold?
Yeah.
It's very low.
I mean, it's more than a couple of $1,000s a year, though. I mean, you can make a few $1,000s. You could make a few $100s a month and still be eligible for TANF benefits. I don't think it's at zero, and this would be approaching barely $20 a month. So, but I mean, we can ascertain the question of what the threshold is to receive. I think it's obviously dependent on the size of your family and circumstances and where you are, but. John, if you can figure out how to ask that question. All right, we've got somebody looking at that.
Thank you. The second question would go to Section 2.3, and I just...
I'm sorry, tell me that, what
Section
page?
2-3, the taxable services.
Page.
Let's see, it's page, well, actually, I'm starting on page 18.
Okay.
And just want to get some clarity on what would actually be taxed. So line 6 on page 18 covers, or actually line 17 is savings institutions, and line 18 is financial transaction processing. My question is, what actually would be a taxable transaction under?
Tell me again the page.
Okay, page 18. I'm sorry, page 17 for the first one. Lines 35 and 36.
Okay.
And then on page 18, line 6. These are all banking-related entities?
Correct.
And my question is, what constitutes a financial transaction that would be taxable? Meaning, are we talking about taxing savings accounts? Are we taxing actual transactions on those accounts? Because we only list the categories, we don't list the actual services that would be subject to the tax.
I think if you get down into the categories of the NAICS breakdown, it clarifies what those are. So correct, but no, I mean, you're not taxing savings accounts. But if you charged, if you go to the institution and get a certified check and they charge you $3 for it, they would charge $3.12. That's a service they provide on the fee, but there's no service usually charged with opening an account. But if you had a monthly service charge, if you have a monthly service charge, that's a service provided to a person, and it would be a taxable event.
Okay. And the last one would be for home health care workers. I noticed that there is an exemption for medical services, but would you consider home health care services for senior citizens to be, or for those who are infirm, would that fall into the category of medical services?
What page in line?
Actually, you don't have, I'm looking at just the general, it's the general language about other personal services. It's on page 21, line 13.
21, line 13?
Mm-hmm.
No, only the specific things included in there are taxed. Home health care is not intended to be taxed. It's not listed in the list.
But could it not be considered a personal service under the very broad language that says all other personal services?
I don't think so. It's certainly not the intent. So whenever someone, everybody likes to go into legislative intent. So to the extent anybody needs legislative intent, by listing those out there, we clearly meant to delineate all the services. We initially didn't think that was a wise idea. We thought that we ought to let revenue do this, and there was a lot of questions, well, what does it include? So we went and got the NAICS code. If you've never done that, you ought to do that sometime late at night when you're trying to go to sleep.
I actually have.
It will assist you. But no, and to the extent we need to say, nothing construed herein shall be... we can make it clear. We don't intend to tax health care services, and that would be health care services. And I don't mind that. I don't think by including all other personal services, I think that's a specific code, isn't it? That is a specific NAICS code, and because that specific code does not have home health care services in there,
Okay.
it wouldn't have it. It's the catch-all for the NAICS, but it doesn't include home health care.
Thank you.
All right. Representative Rice, you recognize for a question.
Mr. Speaker, there are people in my neighborhood who have kids that cut grass, and they ask the question, you're going to make a criminal out of my child? And I think page 10, line 36, 37 covers that, because you're required to file a federal income tax return.
If you're required to file a federal income tax. That was our compromise. It was amazing. When we first came out with this, everybody says, so are you going to tax the mechanic that fixes my car once a year, or you're going to tax a little boy that cuts grass? And I just go, only if they pay federal income taxes. And that's our answer. So we just said, here, let's make it easy. We'll put it in the bill. If you are required to pay federal income tax on the income, and I don't know what the number is as to how much you can make, but you can make a certain amount per year. Is it $600 or something before you require?
You have to give them a 1099.
Yeah, $600 you get them $10.99 beyond. So, no, our intention is not to get the little boy cutting grass or the person that fixes, the light on your car. It's to get people that are providing services as a general course that are in the system. Yeah, that's what she said.
Representative Flood, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have a couple of questions from the bill and then a question or comment on the fiscal note.
Okay.
First question on page 3 of the bill. The income tax credit
Yes.
for the lowest level incomes, why not start the 100% at 0% income? Why start it at 51%?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't think that's right. The Congress just last week, and unfortunately our president signed a bill that says if you make zero income, you can get a refund. That is the most amazing thing I ever heard of. I call that socialism, and I'm not prepared to say if you have zero. I mean, I don't like this, to be honest with you. I'm trying to compromise, but I really don't believe that if you have zero income, you ought to get money back. So I probably ought to just be consistent with that and say 0 to 10, 0. That's why I really didn't want to go to this. This was a compromise to try to get a few people aboard. A compromise I probably shouldn't have agreed to, because deep down inside it was intended. The intent of this is for those people that are paying for groceries to get a credit based on their income, and not to try to be a windfall to people. And that's what I'm afraid it'll become if we get at this 0. So we capped it at 50%.
But the reality is, this is not an income tax credit. It's a credit for purchasing groceries. Even if people are earning very little money, they're still buying food.
Well, that perplexes me. I've heard that argument. If I make 0, how do I purchase food?
How do you survive?
I don't know. I'd say that's the question of both. Both of them are questions that I can't answer. But how can you make 0 and buy food? It is not possible. It means that somebody's making 0 because they're not reporting their income the same as everybody else. I don't believe you can have a penny. I just don't believe you can do that. You can't make 0 and buy groceries. You've got to make something. And so we just arbitrarily picked 50%. Again, this committee can do whatever you want. Every time you adjust this, it costs more money. This program right here, according to the economist, costs $180 million to do this. So if you change it a little bit more, it'll get up to $250 million. And I'm trying to balance this with the cuts we're given, and now this is a credit given back. This is a cost to the state.
Mr. Speaker, if I could interrupt, I just want to make certain we're perfectly clear on what we're talking about. I know we get in these charts, but if you sign your name to a Georgia income tax form that you made $0, and yet you have survived for the past year, you're already in violation of some law, most likely, in regards of false reporting.
I understand. I don't know who does it. I keep hearing this conversation that there's people that make 0. I just don't. I'm not trying to take care of the people that say they make 0. I'm trying to take care of the people that are making about up to the poverty level and they're barely getting by. And those people that say they're making 0, I have a feeling that they're more part of the problem than part of the solution, because I don't believe you can make 0 and survive.
Representative Peake had a question.
Well, before, could I,
Oh, I'm sorry. You had a follow-up, Representative Flood.
I will yield to Representative Peake for a second.
Well, I was going to say, you and I have had this conversation, but I think walk through the math. Walk through the math. Poverty level for a family of 4 is $20,000. If their income is $10,000, let's take under this scenario, or 10,001, they would be at 51%. Therefore, they make $10,000 per the chart that we're giving them the credit for. It's based on that they're spending $9,000 a year on food. So I think it does make sense, the math in the formula. You can't get a credit for more that you spent more than what you actually make, and so that's the logic. Sorry.
Thank you, Representative.
I'm trying to get the chart to see what the numbers.
Actually, I'd like to, if you would, Mr. Speaker, move on, because there are some other questions that I want.
Okay.
That was more of a philosophical question than a technical mathematical one. But thank you for.
Okay, thank you.
On page 12, lines, I guess 27 through 35, that appears to me to be an exemption of sales tax on energy used in manufacturing. Is that the intent there?
I'm sorry, page 12,
lines 27 through. Well, really lines 34 through 36. It exempts sales tax for manufacturers. It's sales tax on energy.
This is just part of the current statute. This is so I'll have to. It just doesn't define that as a retail sale. It's a definitional section on retail sale. It's a current law where we just add. If you turn the page, line 3, those are already not considered retail sales.
Okay. Then the last question I have is with regard to the list of exempted personal services, line 18, page 18.
Page 18.
Line 5.
Okay.
Previously, I guess on page 15, there's an exemption for, on page 15, lines 23 through 25, there's an exemption for services directly in the construction of new residents. But on line 5, page 18, there's a tax associated with mortgage and mortgage brokers. Would that be only for existing homes and not new homes? I'm not clear as to what.
Well, in no event shall any service used directly, on page 15, used directly in the construction of a new residence be subject to any statement. I would say that mortgage loan brokers are not in the construction business.
Okay.
And so to the extent they charge a fee to a person, they charge $1,000 fee, there would be 4% tax added to that. So it'd be a $40 tax on a fee. So if you, whatever the fee is, there would be a tax on it.
And then on the fiscal note, my final question
Okay.
is the $422 million reduction over 3 years. Is there, if this were to work well, and assuming that it does, in the fourth and fifth year, what would the revenue reduction be?
Well, you can take I mean, it goes out. It goes. It's 800 and something million again. The next year is the cut. It's always an $800 million cut. It's kind of. But to say that, let me explain this. In 1996, the grocery tax cut was a $522 million per year cut as well. In other words, this year, grocery taxes was a $522 million cut. Yet you know and I know revenue rose. So I think that reasonableness dictates that you look at fiscal notes only for the window through the year of implementation. And when fully implemented, you know what the cost is going to be. You assume that there's going to be a continued increase in the credit for school property taxes, and there'll be increases in the other categories. But as measured from the system now, it won't be as much money. So, I mean, at some point you have to just cut it off. And I think what we've got on this fiscal note is that year of full implementation, that's when you analyze it through. Presumably, it would cost the same thing plus whatever the inflationary index is the next year, minus 800 and something million. So it's conceivable you could call this a $1 billion tax cut, except for this. We didn't call the grocery tax cut when we did it in 1996 what would that be now, 12 years? That would now put it up at about a $6 billion tax cut. And what I'm saying is at some point you have to cut it off. You cut it off at the year of full implementation, and that's what this does. But and we would make adjustments to the revenue after that. Right now, that's the current projections of the revenue hit.
Thank you.
Representative Parsons, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Speaker.
Yes, sir.
This section 2-3, I have read this over and over again many times in this bill and the previous bill. And I heard what you said about it, and I know that there's a debate about franchise fees and whether or not they should be, how they're applied, and who pays them, who the franchise fees actually go to. I understand that debate, but there would be there's some validity, I think, for perhaps having a franchise fee because these the companies that actually have plants. They have to, they put poles and they go and tear up streets and things like that. I'm reading this. I mean, it would seem, and maybe I'm reading it incorrectly, but wouldn't the customers of the customers of companies that provide their service over satellite, wouldn't they be having to pay a sales tax on that service that others could be getting some kind of exemption from?
Well, today, people who have cable pay a franchise fee. I can't justify. I don't know what the franchise. I mean, the franchise fees are a revenue source for local governments. What they are. I mean, you can't convince me that a franchise fee is anything more than it's a services tax. It just is. And no, it doesn't take care of the cost of putting on poles, because the cable company, in addition to the franchise fee they charge, they pay. And I guess we got a debate right now where cable and the EMCs are arguing about how much cable has to pay for each pole. The argument right now is they pay about $20 to $22, I think is the closest numbers they're at, per pole per year that they're on. And that's not a pass-through to a customer. That's a cost of doing business. So they pay today, cable companies pay for what they do in the right-of-way at a different fee, but they're charged a franchise fee. Now, here's the great thing about the franchise fee, is the cable companies don't get it. The franchise fee, and most of them that I know just put on the bill, if the local government is authorized, I believe it's 5% they're authorized to charge up to. The local government says, here's the franchise fee, and on my bill it says, it's got for cable service or internet service, and it says franchise fee to Paulding County, $4.32, and that's what they pay to Paulding County. That is, I can't think of any reason why you pay that. I really don't know, other than it's a source of funding. I understand the argument that they're going to say was we're about to, the satellite business is going to say, we're going to have to pay tax now. Yes, that's correct. Well, the cable company's not going to also have to pay it. That's correct. We could make a decision on this committee to make them pay it again. I just thought, the franchise fee, I believe, in and of itself, is a services tax. Now, if you want to not give that credit to cable subscribers, you will raise everybody's bill by the 4%. And I think that's what this comes down to, is that if you got a $100 bill for cable today, you'll have a $100 bill for cable tomorrow. If you have a $100 bill for satellite today, you'll have a $104 bill tomorrow. And that's the way it is. Now then, if there's two ways to do this. You could exclude electronic services of some sort. That'd be a big hit for personal services. Or you could not put the franchise fee credit in here. But I think that a very good argument can be made that the franchise fee is a services tax, and that's essentially. And the reason we only charge it to cable companies is because that's all we're authorized to do under federal and state law. We can't charge a franchise fee to a satellite provider. Truthfully, we probably ought to be able to do that regardless of whether we put in this resolution. But I understand the debate, and I hope everybody on the committee understands the debate. The question is the current franchise fee a services tax? If it is, should consumers have to pay it twice? I believe it is, and I don't believe they should.
Thank you.
But I certainly understand the position.
Thank you, Representative Parsons. Representative, let's see, is 25 Representative Graves? I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I have two other questions, but to follow up on Representative Parsons, it seems like we have been debating franchise fees, and there are utilities that have a franchise fee and a sales tax on them currently as well. I think Georgia Power might be one. We had talked about this before, and if you could clarify for the committee, when it comes to business transactions, who is the determiner of that? And we've talked about the border communities and where's who is liable for that sales tax? Is it where it's rendered or who it's rendered to? And can you clarify some of that?
Well, clearly, we're going to have some good regulations to clear this up. But business to business, it's the same as it is now. There's no tax liability. But as you well know, I mean, if you've been in a grocery store somewhere, been in a Sam's Club or something, you've been behind somebody invariably that has said, "Oh, well, this is tax exempt." And you always wonder, well, I wonder why they're tax exempt and I'm not. There's a lot of subjective interpretation that it goes on right now today. And so I'm not going to represent that that's not going to continue. I'm just going to suggest that we've got to try and collect this as due and owing. But businesses would keep up with that and it'd be a matter of not reporting. Now then, if a business makes a sale to an individual, the same as a retail vendor, and I really want to hit this because I want everybody to get this. Today, if you own a grocery store and you sell a gallon of milk to somebody, you're required to charge the local sales tax on that and collect it, and not the state. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that there are merchants that collect none of that tax, and there are merchants that collect the other 4 cents of that tax. But as a general rule, this system works pretty well because we finally have gotten with the UPC labels on all these items in the computer generation that we're in. Most retailers, except for mistakes, accurately report what they're doing because they know that the penalty is if they get caught not doing it, we're going to go after them. Does that mean that there's not merchants that are out there that are not collecting tax? No, you can just sense it. I'm sure you've been in a store like I've been before, and somebody rings something up on an ad machine and says $20, and you hand them $20. You don't know if they're paying tax on that or not because you don't know what their bookkeeping system is. But the system we have in place is set up for the Revenue Department to be able to go in there and stop that. And I hope that if they need people to do that or regulations to do that, we give them the power to do that. And if this passes on the ballot, the come 09, that's one of the things we do. That would be my intent, that Revenue would issue some regulations on how to do this. And as much as, we can criticize the state agency, but, Revenue does a pretty good job with a very difficult task. And I believe if we arm them with some more people in their budget and more regulations, they'll be able to implement the provisions of this effectively January 1st, 2010.
If I could follow up a little bit.
Sure.
So back to some of the analogies we hear or the stories. So if there's accounting services across a border, let's say a state border, who is responsible for remitting that to us?
The border sales is a good question. It's the same as any other rule. If you go across a border to buy an object and bring it back to Georgia, the individual is responsible under our current law today for the use tax. Now then, do people report that and pay that? I would suggest probably not. And unless we have a major crackdown on people for use tax for going across the line, and we're not going to do that. But when it comes to the services tax, I think it would be a little easier to track. And we'll have to have an awareness campaign that says, you owe tax if you go across the border and come back into Georgia if it's for a Georgia service. Let's say tax services. That won't work for legal. And it really wouldn't. You don't go hire an Alabama lawyer. And I'm going to say if you live on the Georgia-Alabama line, you don't hire an Alabama lawyer to do something for you in Georgia as a general rule because they're not authorized to practice law in Georgia. You don't go hire an Alabama real estate agent to do a transaction for you in Georgia because they're not authorized under Georgia law to charge a fee. You don't typically go hire some of those regulated businesses. Are there services, though, that you could hire a lawn service company that's out of Alabama to come across, cut your grass, and not pay the services tax? And I guess you could avoid that. Built into these revenue numbers is a dramatic amount of, shall we say, assumed violations. The revenue numbers that you see assume a large non-compliance rate. If we get better compliance, and I'm sorry Representative Flood is not here, I want to say, if we get better compliance, those numbers go down. And it doesn't cost the state as much money. And we get back to that very first thing, I pointed you on the resolution. We get to provide additional tax relief. And that's what we would do with extra money. But I understand your concern. It's a legitimate concern. There'll be people not paid just as there are people now. It will be an enforcement issue. The obligation will be owed by the Georgia taxpayer who receives a good or service for the sales or use of that service in Georgia.
Thank you. All right. Representative Abrams, you recognize for a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Speaker, one additional question. Can you explain the rationale for exempting, and I say this as an attorney, exempting business legal services when a business is being sued by an individual? For example, my concern is that in a suit between a parent whose child is hit by a company driver, the parent has to pay taxes up to $10,000 on their legal services to defend that suit or to prosecute that suit, but the company would not have to pay taxes on the legal services they receive in the same suit. Can you talk a little bit about the justification for creating that disparity?
I'm not sure if I agree with you there's a disparity. It's just a public policy decision to tax services to individuals rather than businesses, because we're not providing tax relief to businesses, we're providing tax relief to individuals. And it's simply a decision of this body, the House of Representatives, as a policy decision if we wish to do that. I would prefer to tax all transactions of money, including business to business, but I would provide tax relief to businesses. This proposal provides no tax relief to businesses except the cap on the value. So therefore, we're not imposing a tax on business.
If I can follow up, just to press that a little bit further, I mean, there is the proposed cap on businesses, but there's also the additional relief that they are going to receive by being able to engage contractors to engage in a number of services without having to pay for those, but they will still be able to pass along cost if they so choose to individuals. I guess my concern is that there's the direct cost of services and there's the indirect cost of business services, and while there's no direct tax relief granted through the business through this language, there certainly is some tax benefit that I think is going to business. And so I am concerned about and certainly not direct business to business services, but when an individual is engaged in a lawsuit with a business, that does give a substantial benefit to that business on the cost of their legal services while not giving the same relief to the individual.
Well, I think you and I might just have to agree to disagree. I don't believe there's a benefit conferred upon the business. I believe that the individual who is receiving concurrent and more than what they're paying tax relief simply is picking up their portion of the tab for the personal services that they're conducting business in.
Thank you, Representative Abrams. Let me. We slated this committee meeting originally from 1 till 3. We're now beyond that time. We've got a few more questions. We don't want to cut anybody short. I've made a couple of commitments based on that 1 to 3 time, so I may have to.
So I mean, you've got somewhere to go.
Step out, but
well, the new chairman will be glad. I'm sure. Now, if you want to suspend this, Mr. Chairman, I'm okay with that. If you want to continue it to next week, I'll do whatever your preference is.
Mr. Speaker, we've got 3 more questions, and I want to try to get to those. What I would like to say, though, before the crowd gets away, remember at the outset, as we stated, if you have a question or concern, please write that question down. You've now heard the presentation of the bill if you've been in here. Hopefully you'll have even more time to read it and reflect upon it. Get those questions to Ways and Means office. You can give them to Lindsay Napier, who is here now, or Ms. Kay, the Secretary of Chairman O'Neill, and that will help us as we work through this process. But we're not going to cut anybody short, but this will help well-thought questions to be asked, and questions after you've read the bill, not based on ideas or things you've read or heard. All right. Representative Roberts, did you have a question? Okay, I'm sorry. Representative Sims.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
17. 19?
17.
Gotcha.
Mr. Speaker, a couple of questions on a referendum issue. If your Board of Education needs to raise money beyond this cap level, and is it not true that it's going to be a lot harder for that to pass, since the burden of the bill is going to go to business and residential non-homestead properties? Those folks are not going to be wanting to take on the burden of that school system's increase, especially in these high growth areas, such as Gwinnett and even in my area down in the South Georgia region, Valdosta, and those areas.
I think that's a fair question, but I think your premise is misplaced. If they today, on their own, without a referendum, simply raise the millage rate, the burden falls on those taxpayers. So I don't know why it wouldn't be fair if they want to raise it more than the rate of inflation. And this committee has the wisdom to say, if that's not enough, if you want to say the rate of inflation is something else, I pick the rate of government inflation. But if they want to raise more than the rate of inflation, they're just going to go to the same people that's going to pay it and ask them if they want to pay it or not. This whole philosophy that if you don't like the decisions we've made, you'll vote somebody out of office, you know and I know that's not really going to happen. It happens occasionally, but most of the time, by the time you get a chance to go vote for somebody that's increased your property taxes, you've probably gone on to something else. But you can raise that number if you think that's not a fair number. I would suggest that you have it based on reason. I wouldn't just let it be the sky's the limit, which is what it is now.
I understand. Follow-up question, if I may. Manufactured housing is considered a separate type of property within the Constitution. I know they do have homestead exemptions. However, they also have a depreciation over time. Does this bill in any way, can you tell me how that's going to affect property that depreciates over time with that homestead exemption?
Well, it'll give them exactly it'll still give them the complete school tax relief.
I understand.
Whether that's going up or down. I know that theory. I don't know how often that comes into play, but in theory, if your tax liability was going down, you would be getting less benefit from this. Clearly. Okay. If your tax liability is going up, you're going to get more benefit. If your tax liability goes down, you're getting less benefit. But you're getting the whole benefit of the school tax.
I understand. And my last question, if I may. Commissioner Graham came over and he made these statements to us, maybe not in these words, but he said that the 3 states that have implemented this plan before now, 4 states had done it. 3 came back before it was ever implemented and did away with it and abolished it, and the 4th state went in about 6 months and had the legislature reconvene and abolish it. Can you attest to any of that?
So, the services tax. Every one of those states implemented the services tax for the purpose of increasing and supplementing revenue, not as a part of a comprehensive tax reform and tax cut. All of those states were looking to generate more revenue, and citizens said, wait a minute, we already pay enough. We don't want to pay more. In this case, we're giving them immediate relief, sizable relief, in the form of $2 billion to homeowners, and telling them in exchange for the relief we're giving you and taking away your tax on your autos, we're going to ask you to pay this. And it'll be up to the voters of Georgia to decide. That's why we put it on a referendum. Do you want to change this system as set forth in this comprehensive tax reform amendment? And Representative, I think it's a good, healthy debate, and people can decide. I'll also point out that those states, none of those approved that by constitutional amendment or referendum.
I understand.
And we're going to let people decide, you want to do this or not?
Well, I just appreciate the fact that you've come down here and spent all this time in explaining it, and I thank you for it.
I'll come down here again anytime y'all have me. If we have enough members left whenever we're done. Looks like I'm outlasting the members.
We got a couple more questions.
Sure.
Chairman O'Neill.
I don't see, but I hope I'm the last one. He probably needs to get his breath.
I'm fine. Keep going.
David, you want to do one? Mr. Speaker, we had, as you know, I think at least 20 hours of public hearings. And we patiently, I thought, listened as good as I know how to listen. And over, the recurring theme from primarily city governments and school boards was the overriding concern that the consumption tax lacks stability, and that obviously the property tax is very, very, very stable. You spoke earlier, and I don't mean to be redundant, and I thought you answered the other concern was about local control. And I heard, I think,
I'm sorry.
what you said about local control. But on the stability issue, I truly would like your most inner opinion and thoughts. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but like my old friend Larry Walker used to say, I'm going to try to get down where the goats can get it here for just a second.
That is a perfect question for this debate. Those people that will argue that the property tax system is stable are misusing the word stable, because it's only stable because they balance their needs and wants on the backs of the property taxpayers of this state, period. There is no other stability to it. It has no bearing in any economic model or ability of people to pay or use of services or fairness or equity. It's simply, purely and simply, they decide this is how much you owe, you pay it. If you don't pay it, we will take your house. They say they don't take houses, but they do. But it's not the taking of the house that promotes the stability, it's the threat of taking it. And that's why they say it's stable. The sale, we took that argument, though, and that argument is false on its face. I asked our staff to prepare for me an analysis of sales tax income for the state of Georgia for the last 42 years. Because I kept hearing sales taxes are volatile and the economy goes down and sales taxes go down. And if you do this, oh my God, we will have to cut services, and we can't do that. We have these vital services that we provide. That is a specious argument, and it's false. At no time except for once in the history of the state of Georgia has there been a time when there has been an actual reduction in the amount of money received from sales tax data. If you'll look at it at a 3-year average, which is the best way to look at it, it always goes up. We did take a hit on sales tax data in one time, and that was in 2002. Now, sometimes we forget, so I'm going to remind everybody that might have forgotten what happened in 2001. On September 11th, 2001, a bunch of crazy people sought to bring war to this country, and they brought our economy to the knees. The economy suffered because of September 11th, 2001, and that was reflected in the 2002 fiscal year data. Except for that aberration, and if you'll look at the continuation, sales taxes have consistently gone up. There are some tiny little spikes down, but sales tax data just keeps going up and up and up. And we started in 1965 with $208 million, and in 2006 is $5,723 million. The idea that sales taxes are somehow volatile, go up and down, and are unpredictable is just wrong.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't get to quite finish my total question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted.
I might say that was a heck of an answer on the first part of the question. No, don't please. And I hear you loud and clear. But assume just for a second that I disagreed with all of that.
With me?
No, yes, sir. On
Okay.
that one contention about volatility. Here's what I really can't get a grasp on the foundation of the criticism of stability, is that even if you disagreed in total with the actual data facts, which has the one aberration of 1 year, if you disagreed with that. So yeah, we had a lesser sales tax collection in this January than last January. So that is a downturn. We see economic spikes and troughs all the time. Sales taxes are quicker to respond to economic conditions probably than any other tax. The property tax obviously is considered by the revenue users of that tax as the most stable because, in effect, it's 100-to-1 collateralization. A typical property tax is about 1% of the value of the property. Synonymous with a bank transaction, I would have to buy a $100 CD to borrow $1. That's a pretty stable collateralized transaction. I see why folks that rely on the revenue streams are very satisfied with the stability of the property tax. It is a first lien even superior to money purchase mortgages. Even after a foreclosure, taxes remain as a first lien against property. And that's where you escheat into your argument that they will take your property as security. But you have to admit that's a pretty secure revenue stream when you've got 100-to-1 collateralization. How do you feel that by leaving the first lien down here where the goats get it now, it's still on everybody's home, and the state adds its full faith and credit, which is AAA bond full faith and credit, to pay in the local portion of the tax, you still have a first lien even superior to all those mortgages that are out there that some people feel are volatile. 100-to-1 collateralization, and now having sort of like your mother-in-law co-signing your note for your property. How do you feel we've made the school people more unstable, if you believe their argument?
If the property tax system is stable, by doing this, it becomes extremely more stable. It is a no-brainer. If the property tax system is stable, by doing this, we shore it up and put the full faith and credit of the state behind a system that already over-collateralizes, and it guarantees it. Now then you say, well, how does that, I think the better question would be, but how does that comport with my idea of trying to change this? Because we are introducing people to consumption taxes and spreading the burden out over 9.5 million Georgians rather than just the property tax payers. The local systems still get to assess property taxes. They still get the guarantee that they can take your house if you don't pay. They still get the same amount of money they were going to assess. The difference is we give those property taxpayers the money back from all these sales taxes that we're going to charge. And I believe it just makes the system stronger and better. And I believe it's something the people of this state will overwhelmingly support. I hope you'll give them the opportunity. Is that all the questions?
We've got two more, Mr. Speaker. If you're
I thought
okay
you
with
said
just
okay.
two quick ones. All right.
All right.
Representative Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Page 2, line 19, regarding the motor vehicle fee. It is my understanding that the intention here is to give the benefit to individuals.
Yes.
We understand that there are a lot of folks who are out in business who are using vehicles for the primary purpose of business, but they are titled in the individual name. Any comments there?
I think you may have pointed out something that I've missed. I think what our intentions is to provide the complete tax relief to vehicles titled in the name of individual natural persons. But it was not my intention not to charge at least as far as this goes, the $10 fee for trauma care. I intended to charge on all motor vehicles in the state. So if that's what you're pointing out, that I'm not doing that, you're right, and we need to fix that.
Well, actually, I was going to the other thing of a lot of businesses are Schedule C. They're self-employed individuals who use their business, who use that vehicle primarily for their business. And that gets into the individual business argument. What is the purpose for?
We're not, well, I understand that's a possibility. I can't. But we first said we were going to make this proposal applicable to only vehicles which were used for personally owned vehicles. And in trying to do that, it became you can imagine I don't think it's possible to draft a tax, a fee on vehicles that says only vehicles in the name of an individual that are not otherwise used in business, because most people who have their individual, lots of people have individual vehicles that they use in varying degrees of percentages, and I thought that was going to be an extremely hyper-technical argument, so we chose simply to drop down the tax relief to if it's in an individual's name, you don't pay taxes. If it's in a business name, you do pay taxes. Now, will that encourage some people that have their vehicles in their business name to move them to their individual name? I'm sure it will. That'll be a side benefit that they get. But I did just notice that the $20 we're assessing was only on individuals, and that was not our intention. The intention was to charge the $20. My intention was on every motor vehicle in the state. So I've made myself a note to clarify that so that it's charged on every motor vehicle, because that's the only way we're going to be able to fund trauma care. The numbers there's a lot less vehicles in individual names than there are total motor vehicles in the state.
Mr. Chairman, a couple more questions.
Sure.
Real quick. Mr. Speaker, page 15, line 22 through line 24. In your presentation, I was under the understanding that the exemptions would be, medical, child care, educational services. Reading up under there, it looks like there's an exemption in there for the construction of new residences.
Yes.
Okay.
We did not wish to unreasonably upset a market that, especially right now, is very dampened. And we chose to put in there clearly and unequivocally there were not taxing services on new construction. That was a judgment call I made in light of the current state of the building industry in the state of Georgia. I did not wish to put anything in there that could arguably affect them.
One more comment. I guess last is more of a comment, Mr. Speaker, and as I am a CPA and a tax professional, always looking at, preparing returns for both businesses and individuals. I guess one of the issues that I see as a preparer is what is the cost of this is going to be as far as the compliance back to the business community, and a lot of that community being self-employed, individuals. Looking at it from that point, have we looked at a cost of compliance?
I have not looked at a cost of compliance. I would have to know the percentage of businesses that right now do not fill out any sales tax reporting at all versus over a percentage of the whole. I don't know what that is. I don't know if revenue knows that. So it might be impossible of calculation. It would be impossible if we didn't know that. But let me give you some examples. People a lot of times people say, well, what about haircuts? That seems odd. And I go, listen, most legitimate businesses that have cosmetology services already fill out monthly reports because they sell product. A lot of service providers now currently fill out monthly reporting, and those that don't, it will just be a matter of them filling out monthly reporting. I don't know what the cost of compliance is because I don't know how many of those are that now do not fill out that will be required to. I've actually tried to think about it even from my own office, since I'm in a business as an attorney that provides services. 20 years ago, I would have told you it would be almost impossible to implement. In the year 2008, my law firm is, and I think we're so technological now. I mean, we know, how many minutes I spent not talking on the telephone. We keep up with everything in computer-generated, computer-assisted methods, and we know if we got $100 in from an individual for a will, or if we got $100 in from a business client. We just know, and so I think it's going to be a pretty easy for businesses to comply with. It'll be another report they have to fill out. But most legitimate businesses now use people like you to prepare taxes, and so it may be some added expense, but we turn all of our monthly data today over to our accountant. it'll simply be a matter of turning it over, and they generate one more item for us to sign and on taxes collected. And so I believe while there'll be some difficulty for some isolated instances, I think most people in the year 2008 can comply fairly easily. I would not know how to estimate, though, whether that has a cost factor to it.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Speaker, thank you for your patience. We got one more question. And
Sure.
we'll be done. So, Chairman Royal.
Mr. Speaker, I want to revisit the reimbursement to the boards of education.
Okay.
You answered me earlier that it would be the millage rate plus inflation.
That's correct.
Okay, is that in this document or is that going to be in the Senate resolution?
It's in the bill. Hang on just a minute. I'm conferring with counsel to make sure I've got this. Let me see if I can do this. I may need to let me tell you what my understanding, my intentions are, and here's how we will have this drafted if we don't, and I may not can put my finger on the precise point, is if a school system, if you have a $100,000 property and you assess it at 10 mills and it generates whatever that is, $1,000 today, if next year, if they raise that by 10 mills by, let's say the government inflation rate goes up 5%, so it's 10.50 mills, and the bill for the taxes goes up to $1,050. It's my intention, and if it's not drafted like this, we will put in here that the $1,050 will be reimbursed by the state. $1,000 this year, and the next year $1,050. Now, if they go for a vote and take that up so that the tax bill is $1,100, we would only pick up the $1,050. Whatever somebody votes to move beyond that, we wouldn't do. Now, if that's not clearly spelled out, and it may or may not be, we're trying to ascertain this, the rate of inflation of the millage rate would be picked up. In fact, that's in our fiscal note. I know it is. I know the analysis is that we would presume that the amount of relief that we give back to local schools would go up every year.
Okay, I don't think this bill does that. It defines the school millage rate on page 23, line 25, then it applies it on
The 07 millage rate?
Right, and or the current millage rate, whichever is lower. Then you go over on page 26, and you got lines 13 through 18. I don't think this language does what you're saying your intention is.
Okay, well, I think that's what we should be doing, is if they raise it, the rate of, but what we don't want them to do is to jack it up beyond that, and it be a cost that we can't budget. If it goes up the rate of inflation, goes up the rate of inflation. So let me look at that, and I will, if I don't have that, I will get that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Wolf, for your attention. Mr. Speaker, any final comments you want to wrap up?
Well, we still have the Senate resolution to do, so y'all tell me when we're going to meet, and I'll tell you, here's what I think I would like for the committee to do, if y'all will consider this. I think that if your wisdom is to vote the House Resolution 1246 and 979, House Bill 979 out, I think you should, on the same time, vote out Senate Resolution 796, but cleaned up by us. I think we need to clean it up and put them all out together, so that when we get to rules, we send them all through together.
Okay.
And I would propose that. That's the only thing I propose, so I'll be glad to come back whenever you want to. As you know, we are getting close to some deadlines, so I'll be around whenever y'all tell me to come back.
Yes, sir. We will move promptly on this, and we appreciate your patience and willingness to. Chairman O'Neill.
Let me ask you, if you don't mind, I can do this privately too, for the timing aspect of this. if we're going to have written public comment, we're going to need some time to disseminate that. I'm sure that's going to be something that we're going to want to speak to in the overall bill. There may be some amendments that might be considered or not, or some cleanup language. What's your view of what the timing needs to be?
What are we? Are we at day 17 today or 18? Is it legislative day 18? We have 4 days next week, be 22. I think probably, Mr. Chairman, the best course would be to try to have, if we're going to have this out, have it out next Thursday. So I think comments maybe if you put a deadline on them for Tuesday, so we'd have a chance to respond to them and try to get something out. Thursday the 21st would be legislative day 21, which puts you eligible for rules probably about legislative day 23. It's getting really close to that time period.
Would you rather have 2 more or 1 more meeting with the subcommittee and the full committee? Do you want a meeting that's set aside separately for response to those comments?
No, I wouldn't do that. I would let. I mean, I don't want to. Listen, y'all have now heard 30 hours worth on tax reform. We can hear this 10 more times and come up with more. You're going to always have questions. So at some point, you have to make a decision if you want to go forward. I would suggest to you, Mr. Chairman, that we pretty soon vote it out and see what the full committee thinks. I don't know when your next full committee meeting is.
There's one Tuesday and Thursday of next week, but it's still in the subcommittee now, so it needs to be voted here and then there as well. So there's two more votes, but we can do that Wednesday. And that's what I'm saying. Would you be amenable to a subcommittee meeting Wednesday
Sure.
and then a full committee Thursday?
Sure. I don't have anything else to do besides this. I'm serious. I mean, at this point, I'm with y'all.
Well,
Whatever you tell me to do, whenever y'all meet, I'll be there.
Chairman Lewis had a quick question for
Mr. Chairman, the public comments that we might get written in, will they be disseminated among the committee so we'll all have a chance to look at them and possibly discuss any of them that have merit to be discussed?
Yeah, we might actually talk about that at the full committee meeting on Tuesday, and I'll probably distribute them to the whole committee on Tuesday for that purpose. There'll be, I'm sure, a lot of duplication there was in the hearings, and what we'll try to do at the council level is pare all that down to where we do have separate issues for everybody to look at in the time.
Okay. Any other final comments? Remind those who have questions, make sure they get them to Lindsay Napier as quickly as possible. We have no further business. Happy Valentine's Day. Go show some love. We're adjourned.